Hello, beloveds, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, a podcast for those who are survivors of childhood trauma, emotional neglect, and narcissistic abuse. This podcast is hosted by Rachel Leroy, a college professor and trauma survivor. Many of us spend years trying to heal and don't get anywhere. We don't always target the trauma itself, which is so often what keeps us stuck. This podcast is where faith meets science. Rachel is an emotional healing expert with 20 years of experience applying healing modalities that helped her start making progress after nothing else worked. She'll show you how to do the same. Each week, we'll cover a topic that will show you how to heal trauma for good. Please check out our website and show notes at ChristianEmotionalRecovery.com and join the Facebook community, Trauma Survivors Unite, Christian Emotional Recovery.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery. I am your host, Rachel Leroy, and this is episode 14 of season 2 of Christian Emotional Recovery, the podcast. And bear with me this week because I'm going to be doing an impromptu recording, so I don't really have any notes or anything. I'm just speaking from my heart and my mind as God leads me. And this week's episode is called What to Do When the Past Comes Calling. What to do when the past comes calling. So, it's just what it sounds like. It's what happens when things, people, concepts, and temptations from your past come calling you. It isn't necessarily that you did all these bad things in your past, though it may mean that, but we're talking about like before healing. What do you do when temptations to fall into old patterns come along? What do you do when people from your past that maybe you've moved on beyond because of keeping yourself mentally healthy and setting loving boundaries has been necessary? That's what we're going to talk about in this week's episode. First, please take a few moments if you haven't, and you can see it in the show notes below. Go subscribe to the YouTube videos and the YouTube channel. The YouTube channel, you can get exclusive content on specialized topics that you cannot get here on the podcast. So please go below to the show notes and click on the YouTube link and subscribe, please, and that will allow you to get even more of the great material like you see here. Also, please check out the Christian Emotional Recovery Trauma Survivors Unite Facebook group. That's the Facebook group, and you can join that as well if you can agree to the guidelines in the group. And I will have some new things going on soon, so I'll let you know about those in the near future. But thank you so much for going on this journey with me today. And let's go ahead and get started and jump right into what to do when the past comes calling. First of all, I wanted to say that this episode is something that just came to me and something that God put on my heart because it's something that I'm dealing with right now. But if you are following this channel and you have strained relationships or past relationships that are unsafe, unhealthy, or even abusive, you probably understand what I'm talking about. But so when the past comes calling, there are several things, several ways that can happen. One way is that you have old temptations of sin from the past or addictions, and you have the temptation to fall into those old patterns. And in those cases, usually those types of situations are because you've got some kind of mental distress in your life. I am not an expert on addiction. I will not claim to know a lot about addiction. I've not dealt with physical addictions myself. Now, keep in mind that we all have addictions. Addictions aren't just cigarettes and drugs and alcohol, but also food can be an addiction. Love can be an addiction. I don't mean like just wanting love, but like a craving that's unhealthy. Codependency is a craving for love, and it can be an addiction. Approval addiction, addiction for excitement, television, other chemicals that we can put in our bodies that make us feel good that aren't necessarily drugs. addictions to other types of activities like emotional highs and danger and drama. There's actually a lot of evidence that if people grow up in high conflict households and are immersed in and exposed to, in their childhood especially, relationships where people are constantly sparring, like bam, 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 they get this kind of peptide high, is what Melanie Tanya Evans calls it, a peptide addiction. That's kind of a strange term to me, but basically what she means is that if you get stuck in this pattern of fight or flight and you get this sort of high from either putting somebody down or yelling at somebody or getting in an argument, and you get this sense of brief relief from your emotional pain, and you get this sense of pleasure from bullying people, or you get this sense of excitement from being in some kind of conflict. It's not something very many people will admit to, but it's actually a very common addiction, is a need to be in conflict and an addiction to that kind of behavior and to that sort of chemical rush that it gives you. It gives you that cortisol and those endorphins. You could even get endorphins from it. And so anything that does that to your brain is like an addiction. And so in those cases, that's why, among other reasons, why some people sabotage their relationships and pick fights and pick arguments without a good reason. I don't mean like they're trying to discuss something with their partner or their spouse or their family member or whatever, but I'm talking about like you just constantly pick arguments for no good reason, or you want to argue about every little thing. That's an example of an addiction that may not be something that is chemical, but in a sense it is, because you get that fix in your brain because you're so used to it. It makes you feel something. It makes you feel complete. It makes you feel alive. So you don't feel completely disassociated and numb. You just want to feel something, and some people will do anything to feel something. And so that's one way that the past can come calling. If you've been working on having more peaceful relationships and having a more peaceful life. And then, of course, the one that's most obvious is sin and chemical addiction. And sin and chemical addiction, first, sin, it can just depend on what it is. There are addictions that are all kinds of physical things. Like I said, excitement. Some people are addicted to exercise, and that can be good, but even that can be taken too far. Anything that's healthy can be taken too far if the motivation behind it becomes unhealthy. You have to ask yourself why you're doing something and be completely honest and feel in your body as to why am I doing this? Why do I want to do this? It's good to ask yourself that question if you start doing something impulsively. It's good to have good habits, but people can be addicted to food. People can be addicted to sex. People can be addicted to exercise. And those television, I admit that that's my weakness. I love my Netflix and my streaming services, and sometimes I have to back off and say, no, you're going to go outside for a while. No, you're going to go color. No, go help somebody else. No, go hang out with your friends. Go visit your family. But something that takes me away from that addiction every once in a while reminds me that I am in control and I have power in my own choices. And God will guide me there, but God cannot make those choices for you. It is you who makes that choice every day to overcome the things of the past, whatever kind of sin or addiction it can be. And another one is eating disorders. I don't want to say that those are a sin, because people with eating disorders have mental illnesses and they need help. And there's no judgment on that. It's just something where somebody needs to get help, whether they eat compulsively or they're bulimic or they are anorexic. It also becomes a compulsion and an addiction that is rooted in something deeper. And getting to the root of that and treating that part of it along with the disorder or the mental illness or the addiction itself is what solves that issue and resolves it. And also taking responsibility that it might be a lifelong journey to continue to deal with that illness. And for example, that's where chemical addictions come in: alcohol, cigarettes, chemical drugs, over-the-counter drugs, prescription drugs like opioids. Opioids are, you know as well as I do, that opioids are an epidemic throughout the world, not just in the United States. Illicit drugs like cocaine and marijuana, it just depends. I know there are a lot of people that use it medically and use it responsibly, but other things like meth and heroin, they are not good news at all. So those are chemical addictions. Again, it's something where the person needs to get to the root cause of what's causing it. And a lot of times trauma is contributing to or causing the addiction itself. And once you get to that trauma, then you can deal with the chemical addiction and you root it out. You root it out from its source. Because if you just treat symptoms, if you just treat it's not that it's not good to treat symptoms, but you need to do that in tandem with getting to the root of what's causing the addiction, with getting to the root of what's causing certain patterns to recur and to continue to happen. And so that's where when the past comes calling, whether it's a temptation, a chemical addiction, another kind of addiction that's emotional or something, it's good to find out why it's happening at its root source. And then work on that root source and also work on the issue itself at the same time. Some people would argue just one or the other. I argue that you need to work on both. You need to work on both through meditation, counseling, prayer, journaling, using the power of the Holy Spirit, having people pray over you, doing traditional trauma healing, because all of those spiritual things can be helpful. And sometimes they do cure and heal people, but not always. Getting to the source and the root of the trauma in your body, letting it filter back out of your neural network through your mind and express itself is the only way to get rid of trauma. It's the main way, I should say, not the only way. Because talk therapy and venting your emotions, you can only do so much of that to help trauma, because getting it out of the body is the most important thing, but I still think the others are necessary also. Because what I found in my experience in the last few months is I've gotten so busy with doctor's appointments and working on this podcast that I barely take any time to just check in with myself. I do meditate, but I don't have a lot of places where I can just talk things out. And so I'm going to start back doing my journaling so I have an outlet for dealing with the people I'm angry at and dealing with the things that I feel are unfair and getting to the roots of those thoughts that come from trauma. And, that's something that you might try yourself, is pay attention to what's going on, and your mind and your body will start telling you where you need to work. And those are the areas you need to target if they come up again and again and again. And so focus on those areas. And now the other thing that when the past comes knocking is obviously sin. And sin can happen because of trauma, and sin can also cause trauma. And I'm not going to get into the details of this here, because everybody sins and everybody has things in their past they're not proud of. And most people, I think, have skeletons in their closet of some kind. We're not here to pull those skeletons out, but between you and God, you need to have a talk with God and tell Him what's on your heart. And if you have sinned and done things that you're not proud of, and the guilt of that keeps coming up again and again, you need to work on that guilt. You need to root that guilt out. And, regular guilt can actually be healthy because it lets you know what's wrong inside, and it helps you to bring that stuff gently and kindly to the surface and to work on it. Now, when I talk about guilt, I'm not saying you should feel guilty. I'm not saying that guilt should be something that you experience constantly. I'm only saying that if you feel safe with yourself, and you feel safe in your relationship with yourself, and you trust yourself, and you feel safe with God, and you feel safe in your relationship with God, and you trust God, that's the first place you have to work before you can work through those past sins and shortcomings that you have. Sinning only means to miss the mark. That is literally the scriptural translation of sin. It means to miss the mark. And repenting doesn't mean you roll around in ashes and moan and wear sackcloth and tear your clothes. It means that you simply change your mind. There might be some sorrow. You should be sincerely sorry when you do something wrong, of course, but that doesn't mean you beat yourself up. That doesn't mean you shame yourself. Being guilty, feeling guilty, and feeling shame are two different things. Guilt is saying, oh, I did this wrong. I need to fix that with this person. I really hurt them. Or I really messed up, and I know that God would want me to talk to Him about it and ask for His forgiveness and work on what caused that so that we can rectify this behavior. That's totally different than I am a bad person, I am a screw up, I am worthless. So trauma will make you believe those things. And that is not your fault. You need to work on shame. And there's a podcast episode on shame in season 1, and I will put it in the show notes. And you can go to that podcast episode if you want to work further with shame and look more at shame. Okay? But just keep in mind that guilt and shame are two different things. Guilt is, I did this wrong, I need to work on this. Shame is, I am a bad person because I did this wrong. A totally different thing. It's, I am this versus I did this. You see the difference? So when you're working on repenting and overcoming things from the past, whether it's trauma-based or it's something that was done to you that caused you to have certain behaviors, or something that you simply chose to do that you knew was wrong, then repenting is simply changing your mind. And most of the time there will be a little bit of godly sorrow and a little bit of guilt. But you do not continue to beat yourself up when you've asked for forgiveness and you're working on healing. And if you relapse, you say, God, my bad, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. And you get back on the path. You don't beat yourself up. Beating yourself up, some people actually feel like that's a step they have to take in order to come back into the present and live in the now and be right with God. And that is not the case. If you've asked God to forgive you and you've made a mistake and you own up to it, and you work to rectify your behavior and get back on the right path, you're not going to get it right the first time. You're not going to screw up one time and then never make the same mistake again. You might. It depends on what it is. But most of the time, you're going to fall a bunch of times before you get it right. And there might even be occasions where you relapse even though you get it right most of the time. And that's part of the process. I'll say it again. You're not going to hear this a lot in churches. And I could be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're not going to get it right every time. And the Bible says all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. So that means that sinning is not something we do one time. It's something we do ongoing. And God knew that when He got you. So when you repeat mistakes, you learn something each time. Somebody that's trying to kick cigarette smoking, for example, they may try 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times before they kick it. And then they may kick it for 10 years and accidentally pick it back up for a month and then kick it again. You see what I'm saying? It fits and starts. But what you need to be seeing is that you're making progress overall. And that your heart is right towards God overall. And that's how you can deal with the past and live in peace in the now. Now, what do you do if a person from the past comes to you? Maybe you've set boundaries with somebody and you have them low contact. Maybe you set boundaries with somebody and you are no contact because they're abusive or toxic or unhealthy, or they bring out those traits in you, or both, probably both. I have had to deal with something like that recently. I'm not talking about people that are problematic where you can negotiate, maybe set certain boundaries and you can still have a relationship with those people. I have people like that in my life too. I have to tread carefully with them, but I can negotiate with them. I can communicate with them. I can have a limited relationship with them, but I've had to accept that there are certain things they cannot see. There are certain things they cannot do. There are certain things they are not able to rectify because I've asked them a million times and told them how certain things hurt me, and it's just like whoosh, it goes over their head. I don't know if it's because they don't care. I don't know if it's because for some reason they are literally just not capable of seeing and understanding on a visceral level what I'm talking about. But all I know is that there are certain things in certain relationships that you may have to decide, can I stay in a relationship with this person and accept this about this person because it will probably never change. That's one kind where the past will come calling and you may have to reestablish a boundary and say, no, I told you that this was not okay. And there might be certain things about them you can't change, but then like you set that boundary, then you need to reestablish it if they try to push it. And then if there are people who you've blocked because you're setting a boundary for yourself, know this. First of all, if you've been in a relationship that has been hideously abusive and it has caused you grief and angst and pain and chaos and torture, and it's made you shake and cry and have panic attacks and get angry, and you get the idea. But if it's caused you unknown amounts of trauma, and that person comes back to you and tries to guilt you, first of all, they may try the crying, they may try guilting you, especially if there's some kind of a blood tie or a previous romantic relationship. They'll try to guilt trip you, and if that doesn't work, they'll try to love bomb you, and love bomb you simply means there's a lot of things they can do, but they bring up all this positive stuff from the past, because most relationships, no matter how toxic, there was this cycling of good and bad and good and bad and good and bad. That's why you were always confused in the relationship. And if being around somebody, you dread it all the time, and you have this sense of what Joyce Meyer calls evil foreboding, you get this sense of dread and foreboding every time you have to be around them or do something with them. Every time you talk to them, you feel creeped out or unsafe or icky. Those feelings are telling you something. Do not ignore those. And I want to tell you, if somebody has chronically abused you and you set a boundary with them and they try to push through that boundary, they are crossing a boundary that you clearly set. They do not respect your boundaries. Your feelings are legitimate. You have a right to cut extremely toxic people out of your life to feel and be safe, and you do not have to put up with that crap. You deserve better than that. God did not design us to put up with that. There is a certain amount of weakness in people that we do need to tolerate, because none of us is perfect. And there's a lot of people that are very flawed, but they're trying really hard to fall on God's grace and to come up higher and to improve. And I believe in those cases we should show a lot of grace. But there has to be a line drawn somewhere where somebody is willfully or ignorantly, either one, abusing a situation, abusing your boundaries, abusing your goodwill, abusing your kind and gentle nature, and taking advantage of that in ways where they control you, dominate you, manipulate you. If they are doing that chronically and consistently, and if you constantly feel confused, frustrated, tortured, afraid, traumatized, unsafe, dread, foreboding, just this sense of exposure, that is a person that you need out of your life. And that is a person you have every right to set boundaries with. And there are going to be times where that person may come back into your life, even when you think you've set clear and safe boundaries. And they will test that boundary. And it will be like an old addiction coming up, like somebody who is an alcoholic. Now, personally, this is just my opinion. I don't think there's anything wrong with socially drinking in moderation. But the point is, there are some people who are alcoholics and who have alcoholic addictions, and they do not need to drink at all in those situations. And if I were around somebody like that, I would not drink any alcohol out of respect for them and out of setting an example for them. But it's like being tempted to drink alcohol if you're an alcoholic in recovery in a 12-step program. If you've been clean for 3 years and then you get in a big fight with your spouse and you think you might end up getting a divorce, heaven forbid, maybe you don't, but and you had a really toxic romantic relationship before that marriage, and you were a raging alcoholic and you used alcohol to cope with the trauma of that abuse, then you might be tempted to go to the convenience store and be like, oh, well, I'll just buy one beer. It's like with somebody who is extremely toxic and extremely unhealthy. Mind you, I'm not just talking about somebody from your past that's not the greatest person, but like somebody who's really toxic. And maybe there's even an addiction there because of you were codependent on that person. And it doesn't have to be a romantic relationship. It could be an old coworker. It could be an old friend. It could be a sibling or a parent who was extremely toxic and abusive. And in that situation, you're going to feel so much guilt and so much obligation. It's called fog, fear, obligation, and guilt, especially if it's an old partner or an old spouse or an old lover, an old relationship, or if it's a family member, because those ties run even deeper usually. And the emotional connection, the enmeshment there, enmeshment means no boundaries. You're all up in each other's business, so to speak. Even the most intimate relationships should have healthy boundaries in certain contexts. But an unhealthy relationship does not have those boundaries. And so if you are conditioned to enmesh with people, and if you're conditioned with this person who has brainwashed you and abused you, you're not just going to automatically, necessarily, if they come back into your life, feel completely okay. You're going to feel vulnerable, or you could. I'm not saying you will. You could feel triggered. You could feel afraid. You could feel foreboding. You could feel overwhelming guilt, like you should, especially if they try to manipulate you and act like they miss you so much, and they just want to get together and talk, and the past was so great. And, don't let them manipulate you. You keep your boundary. You protect yourself. You don't have to be ugly to that person. The best thing to do is probably, if you have the option, not respond or walk away. Just turn around and walk away. Don't say a word. And people will say, can I do that? Yes, you can do that. Absolutely. I mean, when the Bible talks about turning the other cheek, I don't think that means us stand there and allow ourselves to get punched like a punching bag, literally or figuratively. I think turning our cheek and walking away from somebody who's abusive, and there's a temptation to go back down a rabbit hole that is completely toxic and unhealthy and re-traumatizing, do not do that. Protect yourself. Do not do that. Love yourself. Ask God to help you. Ask Him to help you with that temptation. Ask Him to help you with that guilt. Ask Him to give you the strength and the backbone and the wherewithal to say no, to not respond, to delete the message, to block again, to do whatever you have to do to protect yourself. It is not unchristian to set boundaries with extremely toxic people. And if you want to know more about setting healthy boundaries, I encourage you to read the book on boundaries by Henry Cloud and Peter Townsend. It's called Setting Boundaries, I think. Setting Boundaries, and it's by Henry Cloud and Peter Townsend. And I'll put it in the show notes so you can see that. I recommend that book all the time. You'll see it in probably like 10 other podcasts where I mention it. It's a great book. There's another book, and I'm bear with me because I'm doing all this off the top of my head, but there's another book by, I think it's Dana Morningstar, and it's a book about fear, obligation, and guilt. And it helps you to work through brainwashing and abuse and trauma that you may have been programmed with, that where you were in specific relationships where they would use that holy trinity of fear, obligation, and guilt, and it creates just that, a fog, F-O-G. And I love that acronym because it's so aptly named. And I can't remember the name of the book, but it's something about fear, obligation, and guilt, and it's by Dana Morningstar, I think. But I will put that book in the show notes as well if you're interested. The Peter Townsend book is a Christian book. The other one is more general, just to let you know, but both of them are very good books, and they're both very helpful in dealing with stuff like this. Another book that I recommend all the time that completely changed my life and will also help you with how to deal with people like this, whether you're dealing with them now or they try to come into your life and you have to stay strong and keep them out of your life and keep your boundary no matter what it takes. You can also look at a book called Healing from Hidden Abuse. Healing from Hidden Abuse, and that's by Shannon Thomas. She's a psychotherapist, I think, and she's really good, though. Her work is really good. Healing from Hidden Abuse. But those are some resources I recommend. And the way the past can come calling is sometimes it's out of the blue. Sometimes it's completely unexpected. Sometimes it's a phone call when you're at the dentist office. Sometimes it's a text at 3 a.m. Sometimes it's a friend request on Facebook you don't expect to ever see. Sometimes it's somebody you're talking to in the grocery store that mentions an old abuser, and they may or may not be aware of it. It could be so many things. Did you know so-and-so moved back into town? And you're like, what? So, it could be a temptation from the past in terms of chemical addiction, or in terms of other forms of addiction, or in terms of sin, or in terms of other things from the past that you've put in your past forever, and they need to stay there. So the thing is there's more tools and more resources now than ever to help you deal with all of those things from the past, and to help you to overcome your addictions, to help you to be able to repent, to help you to be able to overcome your guilt, to help you to overcome your shame. And there's a lot of resources out there to help you when somebody tries to hoover you back in. That's another term. Narcissists will try to hoover you back in. Hoovering is just what it sounds like. I think in England, my UK friends can help me out here. I think hoovering means to vacuum. And in the US, we know that that's a famous brand of vacuum cleaner, but it's just what it sounds like. They try to suck you back in. And it's that kind of power that you can't resist in that kind of dynamic narcissist that can be so tempting because they're so charming and so overpowering. But you have to remember the bad things they did to you. You don't do that I don't know if anybody watches Game of Thrones, but you remember Arya Stark, where she would pray her prayer every night, and it would be like all the people she wanted to kill. Okay, that's not exactly what God commands us to do, okay? And that is not a good mindset to have. But I can sort of understand the reason behind what she did was because she was reminding herself of what she needed to do to move forward in her life. And so we're not called to do things in that way, but kind of like Arya, not to keep account or a record of wrongs, as the Bible talks about, but to remind yourself of why you're not with this person and they're no longer in your life. Reminding yourself of the pain they caused you, reminding yourself of all the progress you've made, telling yourself all the things you would go back to, all the progress that you've come from and all the pain that you've overcome that you would go back into. If you list those things when you're in a situation where you're especially tempted to fall back into an old pattern or go back to an old person you should not go back to, remind yourself of why you left. Remind yourself of why you set that boundary. Remind yourself of why you went into the 12-step program. You need to remind yourself of all the ugly things in the past that you got away from. And if you remind yourself of that, it will be a painful thing, but it will jar you out of the hoovering, the temptation of the love bombing, and all of that. So just know that there's a lot of resources here. I'm here for you. The people in the Christian Emotional Recovery group are here for you. There are resources that I've listed here, and you stay strong, my friend. Stay strong and stay true to God and stay true to yourself, and do not go back into the past. You can move forward into the future and have a life you never imagined, but you have to be strong, and you can't let those people and those things suck you back in. Say no, my friend. Overcome those temptations. You have the power to do this. You can do this. And know that we're here for you. I'm here for you. We love you, meaning God and me and people in the group and other people that are going through what you go through. And you can do this. So just keep on and keep on keeping on. And there will be temptations, and they will come up in unexpected ways and in unexpected times. And then you may say no, and then they may come up again, and you have to say no again, whether it's symbolically or literally, or not responding. But you stay strong, and things will get better. You'll have another moment of growth, and you'll get even stronger, and the temptation won't be quite as bad the next time, or you'll be better in dealing with that situation. Thank you so much for listening to me. This is called What to Do When Your Past Comes Calling, and this is episode 14 of season 2 in Christian Emotional Recovery. I'm your host, Rachel Leroy. Like I said, if you haven't, you can find you can go and subscribe to the YouTube channel. You'll get stuff there, resources and videos there that you cannot get here at the podcast. These are usually, though not always, separate videos and talks. And also, go to the subscribe bell, click on that, and subscribe. If you haven't, check out the Facebook group called Trauma Survivors Unite Christian Emotional Recovery, and check out the webpage christianemotionalrecovery.com for other resources as well. Thank you so much for going on this journey with me. Thank you so much for listening. God bless you, and have a great day.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Christian Emotional Recovery, hosted by Rachel Leroy. For links to this week's resources and to join the discussion, check out this episode's show notes at christianemotionalrecovery.com, where you can also find links to our YouTube channel and Facebook group. Join our email list and get other episodes and resources. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review the podcast and tell a friend who may benefit from this message. See you next time. And remember, beloveds, God loves you, and you are fearfully and wonderfully made.